So we may proceed. Igqwethe elikhulu lana lelihleli phambili bekade lingithethisa lithi mina angizange ngisikhulume isiZulu ekuqaleni kodwa kodwa umhleli wereport lukwazile ukukhuluma ulimi lwakubo so manje nakusho ukuthi ke kule session lena sesizokhuluma isiZulu ke. Yeah, thank you very much. We are running a little behind, quite a bit behind. So I am going to be quite a bully, and the speakers who are coming next, I must just let you know that, if you go to page 2053 of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I mentioned there for very gross violations of human rights. So if you go over time, just refer to that particular section of the TRC report, and that you may just be victim to that. Some very gross violations of human rights. In this session, we are going to be looking forward, as Valdemar did say, and very practical ways of what can be done to move this thing forward, and what should we be doing to resolve this issue. And there will be various speakers, and we'll go also into the scientific area as well. But our first speaker in this session is President Kgalema Motlanthe, who, as cliches would say, would have it, needs no introduction. He's the former Secretary General of the NUM, former Secretary General of the African National Congress, former Deputy President of the African National Congress, former President of South Africa. And he held the position for 8 months, and I think it was a very good 8 months, and we were all hoping that those 8 months wouldn't end, but yeah. Anyway, he is really one of the greatest South Africans. I'm a very understated South African, one of the wisest South Africans, and he is an elder statesman. We are really privileged to have him as one of our elders in this republic of ours, and to have him in a role that actually where he can expand and he can impart his knowledge and his wisdom and his leadership in a way that's non-partisan. One of my favorite quotes of all time comes from President Motlanthe. It was during a time when Tony Ngeni had been convicted of various crimes, and he was now appealing, and people were saying the ANC should dismiss him, should be stripped of his positions and on the NEC and so on, and he should not hold any positions. And so he was asked, at the time Motlanthe was Secretary General, he was asked kind of like, what is the ANC going to do about Tony Ngeni? And his very timeless answer was, the ANC only intervenes when your own conscience fails to guide you. And basically was saying that Tony Ngeni, needs to be guided by his conscience, but we all know that, there was very little conscience there to guide him. But I mean, like, it spoke much bigger than the ANC, because I think it was a much broader statement, because it is about the consciences of our republic. And in this particular debate that we're having, also we should be guided by our own conscience, all of us in the various spaces that we are in. And it does not need a word from above to guide us into how do we resolve this issue, how we move forward in this particular subject. But having said that, without taking up too much of time, may I ask President Motlanthe to come to the stage and speak to us.
Thank you very much, Mandi, Program Director, for your kind words of introduction. And of course, the matter of language and the language that we use is very important. When we were in prison, the Department of Information used to furnish us with an official publication of the department. And so in February, they give us an issue in isiZulu, which would be called Ingubela. And then in April, the issue was with one in Ichivenda, which is called Mvelapanda. And the next one would be in Setswana, Tswelopele. And in all the African languages, the information contained would be exactly the same. The captions and the photographs exactly the same. And so we found value in laying them down like that and reading them so you could improve your vocabulary in all the languages. So we appreciate the importance of language. But more on a more serious note, let me firstly thank Valdemar Pelsa, editor of Rapport, and Mondli Makanya, editor of City Press, for inviting me to deliver a few remarks on today's land Indaba. The burden of historical circumstance and their aftershocks have brought us to our present historical moment, where the land question is loaded with more than the matter of terrain and a place to call home. A long history of dispossession, exclusion, and legalized oppression has resulted in multiple realities being caught up in interrogations into land, such that it has become a hotly contested and divisive matter that chaotically captures our post-apartheid consciousness. Attached to land, therefore, we find poverty, inequality, unemployment, and a range of social and identity-focused questions that our state has yet to bring to a point of rest and restitution in the post-apartheid context, which is marked by profound historical continuities that belie the prefix that pronounces our separation from the past. In the waking hours of democracy, South Africans were exultant, their spirits infused with the hope that, along with other forms of newfound freedom, the African National Congress would liberate them from the narrow corridors of the apartheid system, releasing them into the open and unchained realm of democratic liberties. From homelands to urban areas, they believed that the words of the Freedom Charter and the slogan, Maibuye Africa, as it was reconstituted into the interim and the final constitutions, believing they would see freedom realized in multiple forms, including land. Today, they still await this return of the land. This morning, I have been asked to interrogate the burden of historical dispossession as it relates to our crafting of a way forward in a manner that ensures that those previously and presently disadvantaged can derive real benefits from the plans and policies put in place as a response to such dispossession and oppression. As the high-level panel report reveals, and I quote, South Africa's statute books tell the story of the country's history of conquest, domination, and racial segregation, close quote. This is poignantly and poetically captured by Desmond Tutu when he said, and I quote, when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, let us pray. We closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land, close quote. Over the course of centuries, a legal system premised on unconscionable terms sought to divide and rule the South African nation through a web of linked laws that differentiated between people along racial and class lines. Collectively, the Natives Land Act 27 of 1913, the Native Trust and Land Act 18 of 1936, the Group Areas Act 41 of 1950, and the Group Areas Act 36 of 1966, and the Bantu Homeland Citizenship Act of 1970, among other legislation, established a system of agrarian oppression. As supreme law of the land, the Constitution has attempted to address the devastating realities wrought by such legislation through founding the new South Africa on inclusive terms that seek to remedy the past's injustice, segregation, and domination. However, when observing our present context, it is evident that our break with the past is not being a clean one. While the introduction of legislation and policies that includes the Restitution of Land Rights Act of 1994, the Reconstruction and Development Program, and the White Paper on Land Policy of 1997 have sought to bring clarity to the matter of land, recent findings have revealed that we have yet to realize the promises that carried the struggle and founded our democracy. Seeking an in-depth analysis of contemporary South African life over the course of the last year, I had the privilege and honor of chairing the high-level panel appointed by the Speakers Forum and comprised of 13 other eminent South Africans. In a period spanning 22 months, we traveled across the length and breadth of South Africa, consulting with experts and hearing the voices of citizens through a series of public hearings. The three broad areas that we were required to consider were poverty, unemployment, inequality, as well as the creation of an equitable distribution of wealth. Land reform, restitution, redistribution, and security of tenure, all of which require the passing of a law of general application to realize these aims, and lastly, nation building and social cohesion. Mandated to consider the impact of the new body of post-apartheid legislation on its citizens, the high-level panel rigorously inquires whether laws since 1994 have effected fundamental changes in poverty reduction, land, inequality, and job creation through questioning their content, context, implementation, and effect. The platform's nature was designed to be inclusive, ensuring that the voices and inputs of marginalized and dispossessed citizens were heard and, most importantly, listened to, and a report was delivered to Parliament. We sought narratives that would reveal the realities of our two-decade distance from the dawning of our democracy. Over and above individual interests and beyond the partisan politics of party concerns, we aimed to unearth the interests of South African citizens, hoping it would form a composite image of the road we had traveled since the sun went down on apartheid. Over 10,000 individuals came forward to make their contributions, sharing how their lives had been affected by the cross-haired intersections of the apartheid and post-apartheid eras. Their stories brought to life matters of redistribution of wealth, inequality, rural development, poverty, nation building, reconciliation, security of tenure and restitution, and, of course, land reform. The testimonies, contributions, and evidence heard throughout the near 2-year-long process revealed that the ills of the past are being reproduced in post-apartheid society despite extensive legislative reform. The need for land reform has always been one that is clearly articulated over the course of the struggle against authoritarian and tyrannical forces, and in our present, where we are attempting to achieve social cohesion. As a pushback to these efforts and discourse, many negative views that permeate our present dialogues are often driven by class interests that seek to maintain their privileged status, becoming a matter of exclusion that operates against constitutional aims through their individualistic concerns. The Constitution mandates and demands our urgent interrogation into the matter of land, which we must subject to high levels of scrutiny and consideration in a manner that considers the well-being of all who live in South Africa, not simply the interests of a few partisan and privileged groups who continue to enjoy the spoils of separatist ideals within our present context. The reality is clear. Citizens deserve equitable access to land. As a high-level panel report lays out, and I quote, "The Constitution provides for 3 rights to land: the right to equitable access to land, the right to tenure security, and the right to restitution," close quote. The progressive realization of these rights has been profoundly slow, and therefore the report notes that, and I quote, "The development of policy and law has drifted away from its initial pro-poor stance and lacks a vision for inclusive agrarian reform," close quote. As President Cyril Ramaphosa noted at the ANC's Land Summit earlier this year, and I quote, "We need to acknowledge that the lack of progress in land reform can be attributed to a great extent to weaknesses in the institutions responsible for effecting our policies, to inconsistencies in legislation, to misguided interventions, and to a misallocation of resources," close quote. In thinking about the poor and marginalized, deriving tangible benefits from policy and legislation, the recommendations of the high-level panel report are simple and straightforward. They hold that the land must be given to the people, including people who live within the jurisdiction of traditional leaders and those in urban areas. Additionally, they express the considered belief that the Constitution allows for expropriation without compensation, and also lists the factors that must be taken into account in determining levels of compensation. As Advocate Ngugai Toby noted at the Land Summit, and I quote, "For purposes of expropriation of land without compensation, it is clear that there is no constitutional impediment as such. So, what I would suggest here is that we consider passing legislation that would make it explicit that the state has the power to expropriate without compensation," close quote. I will not spend too much time on the question of communal land, because I believe Dr. Aninka Claessens did justice to this topic. Rather, I turn my attention to the question of urban land. With regards to urban land, we are required to give as much attention to land tenure rights in rural areas as we would regarding urban areas when considering restitution. The release of well-situated urban land is critically important towards multiple interconnected ends that address all three broad areas that the high-level panel considered. It is clear that the demand for land lies in the urban areas, given its access to employment and infrastructure. Presently, people residing in urban townships lack security of tenure and are unable to use their properties as collateral to get into the mainstream economy. Consequently, a key part of addressing the matter of land lies in issuing people in urban areas with title deeds, including those who have been paying rent in townships, to enable access to assets. With regards to rural land, the high-level panel believes that the process must not be hamstrung by long-winded processes of surveying. Rather, we hold that technology can be utilized to record where people presently reside, granting them security of tenure through legislation that gives official recognition that they own the piece of land they occupy. And in closing, as we chart a way forward, we are all ultimately responsible for shaping the direction of our South African future and lifting the spirits and material conditions of marginalized South Africans out of centuries of despair and degradation. While there have been multiple stumbling blocks to the realization of progress in land reform, we are required to take seriously the reality that until the question of land is addressed, we will be unable to build the country envisioned by our Constitution. Belonging, unity, and identity are tied up in the terra firma of our country, and as such acutely affect our efforts at reconciliation and social cohesion and people's material lives through the access that land brings to social security, the economy, and employment. Many will ask how this can be achieved, and the answer is through collective responsibility. Over the course of the high-level panel commitments, what we found is that individuals who attended the public hearings did not only submit concerns, demands, and complaints, they also put forward wonderful and practical suggestions. As we strive to arrive at a new legal framework for the country's land reform efforts, we are constitutionally required to ensure that these are pro-poor in nature and do not simply cater to elite constituencies and those who have benefited from historical privilege. Implementation will be critical, as our report of the high-level panel noted, that, and I quote, "No law currently exists to give meaning to or set standards for measuring whether land reform enables citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. This law will provide guiding principles and definitions for terms such as equitable access. It will also provide for institutional arrangements, requirements for transparency, reporting and accountability, and other measures to ensure good governance of the land reform process," close quote. Consequently, we are required to delineate the process necessary to address the land issue through dealing with it sequentially. First step, we can consider the issue of security of tenure in the urban areas, then provide such security to farm dwellers and labor tenants, and then extend this right to people living in rural areas. Finally, we can then consider the issue of commercial farms leased by black people, as well as other commercial land. To give effect to this process, we must get our legislators or members of parliament to pass a law of general application as directed by Section 25 of the Constitution. Thinking about the issue of land in terms of sequential steps would address certain sources of national grievances, as well as deal with land hunger as far as it pertains to the majority of South Africans. At present, land reform is considered in macro terms, and as a result, all sectors are gripped by fear and uncertainty. Therefore, we are required to think systematically about solutions taking this reality into account. While the matter of land reform appears complex and its difficulties are clearly visible, we continue to labor under the injunctions of our Constitution, pressing on in spite of and because of contemporary discord and cacophonous conversation around the question of land. We do so as we seek to realize the first sentences of the Constitution, which state, and I quote, "We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of the past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity." Close quote. And I want to thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, President Motlanthe. I think you were 37 seconds over. Yeah, very impressive, I must say. Yeah. If I can just say one thing, which really struck as two words, temporary discord. I think let's hope that it is exactly that, temporary discord, and that we will be able to find a way forward, and which is sustainable and long-term. And I think we move to what we could possibly call the Donald Trump section of this program, where we will be discussing this nebulous concept, which is obviously a myth, something called climate change, as Mr. Trump would have us. Mandi Smallhorne is a science journalist and who has written for us for this particular project on this matter. If you could please come up, thanks.
There's always this terrible discrimination about short people. I'm delighted to be here and to talk about a completely different subject. I feel like the odd one out here. But this is a very important factor to throw into the mix when we make our decisions about land in the future and how we're going to use it and how we're going to enjoy it. I'm delighted to hear fellow speakers talk about rejigging our vision for the future of how we possess and how we manage land, because this factor, this is the real baddie. I'm going to start with a little bit of a science lesson quickly. That's our Earth, and there are three components of our Earth that sit on the crust of the Earth, that little grey layer, that tiny little blanket that covers our whole Earth: air, water, and soil. And barring only gravity, there is nothing more important to our ability to live on this Earth. Without them, we are flying around space. And on the top of the crust of Earth is this tiny little layer. I mean, it's like 0.00001% of the crust. And that's the topsoil. The topsoil and the subsoil is where life happens. This is where everything we eat comes from. And everything that we eats needs the topsoil. Okay? The topsoil is full of life. It is bacteria, it is fungi, it is roots, and it goes down very, very deep. There are places on Earth where it's meters and meters deep. And it is where the plants talk to each other, where they get their nutrition from that ultimately we benefit from. It is critical stuff. And this is what we do to it. We plow it, we tear it up, we put developments on it. Every time I go past another new townhouse development in Joburg, I sort of close my eyes and go, boom, all that topsoil, that lovely topsoil gone once again. We tar it over, we seal it off from communication with the air and the water. And as a result, this happens. Does anybody have any idea where this picture comes from? Sorry? This is a real picture, and it comes from the Dust Bowl era in the United States. People went into the prairies, not understanding the topsoil of the prairies, and they dug it up, and they had a wonderful time. For some years, they flourished enormously. And then there were droughts, and then there were winds, and that happened. Dust blowing everywhere. 2 years ago, I saw this very thing in the Free State of South Africa. It's something frightening. People might remember John Steinbeck wrote about it in The Grapes of Wrath, or as I once saw in Japanese translation, The Angry Raisins. Okay, so we have an enormous amount of highly erodible soil in South Africa. I'm sure you've all seen erosion. People who've got farms here will know that erosion is a major problem. And we often make it worse with the way we behave around our soil. And we can't afford to. South Africa has only 12% of land that is good for crop production. Only 22% of that 12% is high potential for crop production. Okay. At the moment, we are losing on our farmland an average of 12.6 tons of topsoil for every hectare planted. Now, can you do the maths? We're in a deficit situation that is quite dramatic, given that topsoil can take between a couple of years and 100 years and more to develop a centimetre of topsoil. I want you to look at these maps and see the commonalities in these maps. There's your arable soils. Can you see how a lot of the coloured in area there is similar to the highly erodible areas there? There's a lot of our good soil that's on highly erodible land. Bear in mind that we're talking about irrigated. That's a lot of our vegetables and things like that are irrigated. Rain-fed, so maize would be a rain-fed crop. And then pasture land. We've got a lot of pasture land in South Africa. That's an area that is not fed by anything other than rain, but it's not fed by rain sufficiently to plant crops. Now, this is a water map. And once again, looking at the coloured in areas, you can see that some of the very important areas for water availability are also in those same small areas. And that's a very important thing to remember. We have very good soils, for instance, in parts of the Free State that just aren't useful for planting crops because there's no water available. There's no groundwater and there's not enough rain coming. And now here's another one. This is mining. Now this is why I wanted you to look at the colored in areas. This is where mines are at the moment. Also a lot of licenses for mining fall into those areas. Can you see how closely they correspond with some of our better soil? In Mpumalanga, we have a specific belt that is highly vulnerable to mining license prospecting. And that belt happens to be an area that is like insurance for us. It's where maize can be grown when the rest of the country is in drought. And what's going to happen there? For the sake of 25 years, perhaps, of profit, for whom? For an elite. We are going to, as the one scientist said to me, we are going to take the topsoil and throw it in a washing machine. Because once it's been through the process of being upheaved, particularly for open cast mining, you can't reconstitute it. You can't put it back. It's going to take a long time to rehabilitate, more than generations. And this is why I wanted to throw into this mix Sheena Duncan's comment. Sheena Duncan used to say, you can't own the land. The land belongs to God. And I think expressed in that is a sense of stewardship. This is not our land. You are given the right to use it for a while, but you are also the steward of it for the next generation and the next generation after that. And you have to treat it with kindness and care. And I would like to make a plea to the people who are making policy around land to take these factors into consideration as they make policy on land. You should have an element of accountability. Whether you are talking about farmers, and I want to say here quite clearly that in my experience, farmers are more accountable in that sense very often than anybody else. They have a sense of, this is not my farm, this is my child's farm. I'm going to pass it on to another generation, so they're more aware of that kind of long-term legacy than somebody who's building a shopping mall. But everybody who uses land, I think, should legally be required to account for how they use that land and how their use of that land is affecting following generations. Okay, so now here comes the fun part. Lucky old South Africa. We're all facing climate change. It's happening already. We all know that. South Africa happens to have got really lucky on the climate change score in the fact that we benefit, oh no, sorry, I'm being sarcastic, of course. We do not benefit from a particular climatic situation that affects southern and eastern Africa. That means that we're going to be hit harder than anybody else. The whole of Africa, according to the scientists, will experience 1.5 times the additional temperature rise that the rest of the world gets. So, you know, if it's 3% in the rest of the world, Africa will get 4.5%. South and Eastern Africa are likely to get twice. So if it's 3 degrees elsewhere, 6 degrees here. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be 6 degrees greater every single day. It means that we're probably going to have heat waves that shoot up well beyond what is tenable for agriculture in certain parts of the country. A few years ago, I interviewed a scientist who was studying farming in Limpopo, and she was telling me about the experience of the farmers there, which is that they get their seedlings into the ground. This is small-scale farming, not subsistence, but not commercial level. Get their seedlings into the ground. They get coming along nicely, you know, foot tall or whatever, and along comes a heat wave. One of these 39, 40 degrees, relentless heat waves, 5, 6 days pass by. Plants are dead. We've got enough seed left for another planting, so we plant again. They get to 1 foot or whatever, and there's a huge rainstorm. Massive rain. Washes away the fields. There are no seeds left. It doesn't take a whole season of peculiar weather. It just takes 4 days here and 4 days there. And people are seriously, seriously impacted by that. So that's our misfortune in this part of the world, is that we are going to face really, really challenging times in this immediate future. It's here already, and it's coming fast. So let's talk about how that might affect where and how you farm. In one of the stories that I wrote for City Press, I told the story of being at a farming conference. And the most conservative-looking farmer there, I mean, there were some young, funky farmers there, but there was this boer from my childhood sitting there, bald head and two-tone shirt and everything. And he put his hand up, and I thought, what's coming now? And he said, I want to know, is the government making contingency plans for how agriculture is going to change? When we have to move where we are going to plant our staple crop, have they put in contingency plans for silos, for railway sidings, for access to markets? And I was like, he was way ahead of everybody else. He knew, as farmers so often do, they're in touch with what's going on. He knew what was coming. So, in a master's thesis from a couple of years ago, this young man put together a few maps showing what's potentially going to happen to maize planting in the Free State area-ish. The blue is where we plant maize. And look at its low yield and high yield maize. Look at how that blue puddle changes in shape and moves. Okay, so you've got an increase in maize potential in the Eastern Cape and in Southern KZN, and a shrinking of the area in which we can plant maize successfully. That's the kind of thing we need to know in detail. We need our government to be supporting science in this area so that we can bring these predictions down to, block by block level. This is just a fun picture of why we need to care, showing you how our temperatures are rising. When I first saw these predictions for this part of the world, I still have the notebook. I was sitting at the CSIR, and Dr. Francois Engelbrecht was providing these predictions. And I wrote in my notebook so hard that it went through the page. Botswana, gone. Southern Angola, gone. Namibia, gone. I mean, I was actually emotional. I was feeling tearful. The Northern Cape, what's happening in the Northern Cape? We have got serious challenges in the future. And it's not just temperature. It's changes in the rain. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get less rain. In the Western Cape, there are two potential predictions. One is that they're going to get about 22% less precipitation in the future. The other one is they're going to get around about the same kind of rain overall, averaged out, but it's going to come in big doses. So you're going to have floods. You're going to have the Cape Flats flooding over and over and over again. And you're going to have those other problems that I mentioned in Limpopo coming along. Washed out crops, damaged crops from severe storm. There are other things. Everybody thinks about climate change. When I say climate change, people say, you mean global warming? It's as though warming is the only thing that's happening, but it's not the only thing that's going to change. That warming, those changes in the climate, are going to expose us to other problems. For instance, that little chap in the center there is the army fall worm. Have you heard of it? A worm that ate maize all over Zambia and Zimbabwe and came here. Scientists say that it's an invasive little beastie to start with, but secondly, it's triggered by drought. So have a drought year, and when the rains come, boom, here comes the worm to chew up your crop. Down at the bottom, the warmer weather is also opening up areas for invasive aliens. That's the pom-pom weed. I don't know if anybody's noticed how far the pom-pom weed has made it through Gauteng, but it's like past Pretoria now, I think. Yeah. I put in the goats because we need to think about the impact of what's happening on animals as well. All mammals live at roughly the same temperature, the 37-ish degree mark, and if it goes into heat wave territory, then it's just as bad for the animals as it is for us. You are not going to get the milk out of your dairy cows that you would hope for, and you will have animals dying in heat wave conditions just the way humans will. And humans will die. We need to think as people who farm about what happens to the people who work out in the farms. They are going to be tremendously affected by the heat out there. In India, for instance, they are busy changing the way some people in outdoor terrain work, so that they come into work very early in the morning, 4 o'clock or something like that, and then they have the whole middle of the day from 10 o'clock to 3 or 4 o'clock off, and then they work again until past dark, in order to avoid the dangers of the high temperature. And just to give you an example of one of the potential dangers, there's a disease, an epidemic across the tropics that has affected young men who are sugarcane cutters, primarily sugarcane cutters. They are people who are expected to get to work on their own steam, so they walk. That means they only carry with them 2 liters of water, because you can't carry that much water. There's no water available to them as laborers while they're sugarcane cutting, and so they dehydrate. They need to drink probably 5 liters in a day like that, and they're only drinking 2. It affects their kidneys. Suddenly this young man is in hospital, and he's dying of renal failure because he hasn't had enough water. So farmers are going to have to think about providing water, providing hats, providing decent clothing that covers people adequately to protect them from the sun, providing shade, providing time off in the worst hours of the day. There are solutions to this problem, and they are interesting ones, and they are ones that require a kind of rejigging of vision. How do we do things in this country? How do we think about farming? The scientists that I've spoken to have been very clear. Farming can go on. You can even be pasturing beasts in the Northern Cape, but you're going to need a lot more land. You're going to need thousands of hectares for a herd where before you maybe needed 1,000. Because the vegetation simply won't be growing at a sufficient rate. The consensus seems to be that we need mixed farming. We need farming that is not just one crop. No longer the monocrop idea, stripping the land and putting one crop across the land like that. I'm amazed at how many very conservative, you would think, people are talking about conservation agriculture. Conservation agriculture, and that's illustrates it on the side here on the little shoots, is based on several pillars, and one of those is no-till. You don't strip the land of vegetation. You use these very expensive machines that put little spikes into the land, and they drop a seed. Spike, seed, spike, seed. So that there is vegetation left on the land, so that the topsoil doesn't lose all its integrity as you plant. Another one is a pillar of conservation agriculture is to keep a cover crop on the land, never leave the land completely bare, or if you can't do a cover crop, leave a mulch on the land. So when you take the mealies off, you chop them down and leave the mulch lying on the land so that the land is protected. And the other thing is diversity. You need to have more than one crop, plenty more than one crop, and you need to have animals on your land as well. That picture at the bottom is an illustration of intercropping. So using the idea of not leaving the land bare and protecting the land to get another crop out of the land. And when we talk about diversity, we're going to have to look at animals differently. We can't necessarily use the variance of various animals that we have always relied on. They may be too sensitive for the conditions. So that's a nice little indigenous cock in the corner there. We need to think also about how we use our land. We need to think about whether we want a farm in this area or whether we want to pasture wildlife in this area. I gave you a little list of what the emerging farmer will look like. I think a lot of farmers are already on the road to this, but you need to be agile, adaptable, tech-wise. I think that farming in the future is going to be a combination, interesting combination of old knowledge, old wisdom, and high tech. I know of farmers who are using drones to watch the flow of moisture through their land, for instance. I know of farmers who are checking exactly to the millimeter how much water they need in their orchards because they've got sap flow monitors that tell them that at this point you only need 10,000 litres in this orchard instead of the 20,000 you used to put in that orchard. So I think that tech is going to be very, very important in the future, and it's another part of the policy that I think that you need to take into consideration is an emerging farmer is going to need these things. He's going to need 450,000 Rand to buy a no-till plough, and he's going to need to be able to use tech. He needs to be in touch with the land, and I think that's something farmers are already, but they're going to get more. Alert, immediately responsive to changes in his local climate, farming in the right place with the right mix of crop and livestock, and that results in a resilient farmer for the future, a climate-changed future for South Africa. Thank you.
So I'm glad you ended on that note. Because, yeah, I was about to suggest that we move straight to the drink section. Yeah, I think I would rather go with Donald Trump than the earlier picture that you painted. But thank you very much, Mandi, because I think that really is a very practical thing, because it's not an abstract thing. Actually, it is about the soil, it is about the climate, it is about how we farm. The next speaker is someone who once upon a time was a hip and happening savvy public servant who could be seen in the trendy night spots of Joburg, Cape Town, and Pretoria. And he gave it all up to go and live in some rural village somewhere in Venda and be in charge of the community. Chief Matsila is the head of the Matsila community, and probably one of the most progressive traditional leaders in this country. I happen to be lucky enough to have been to the village, and what he has done to that village, it's a model. It's really a model for development, for rural development. I mean, it took not quite a dust bowl, but a really non-happening place and turned it into a very vibrant, economically active community where people actually now are doing very productive things and even have access to, people have have bank accounts and are able to use ATMs for the first time in their lives in their 50s or 60s. People actually got access to ATMs. So I mean, like, it's a great success story. And if you can corner him to invite you to the village, I would really suggest that you do so. There's a very nice lodge there as well. So you will not be living in a rural setting as you know it. But anyway, so Chief Matsila will be coming up just now. I just need to make a correction as well. There was in an earlier session when we were sitting over there, Anika did use an example. She spoke about a time during one of the hearings where she spoke about a chief, a traditional leader who was engaged in activities with young women in the village in order for the family to access land and what. And she said, and I'm looking at the traditional leader, and some people here thought maybe because she was looking at this traditional leader, it was a traditional leader at a hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandi, and your colleague Valdima, and the entire stable of Rapport and City Press for inviting us. Let me acknowledge all the leaders that are here, starting from His Excellency, the former President, and many leaders of political parties, and the journalists that are here. That statement, this issue around Dr. Klassen, an injury to one is an injury to all. But on a serious note, I would like to appreciate this opportunity. It's rare for us as traditional leaders to be given platforms like this, and we really appreciate it because normally people talk about us in our absence, or they talk about us without us. So I would really like to talk about the issue of communal land. What are some of the way forward that we need to have in relation to that? So I can operate high technology stuff that we don't have in the village. So the first thing that I really want to look at is the issue of communal land ownership, the land use options that are available, the question of spatial planning in communities, socio-economic challenges, governance models, integrated approach to community development, and a bit about the Matsila case study, just to share with you some of the things, and maybe some conclusion and way forward. The issue is, as we grapple with the whole question of land expropriation without compensation, how will this affect us as communities? Now, in that regard, the ANC has given us partial answers that this process will not affect communal land. I say partial answers because there's not clarity at the moment as to what will actually happen to communal land in real terms. And what we need to look at will be beneficiation and empowerment of communities. This remains a conundrum, as you can see from the discussions that we're all having here. You see, the Ingonyama Trust issue has sparked the debate. Suddenly the wheels were off. As I was coming here, I said to the king, our king, Mpepura Mabrana, that I've been invited to the land in Indaba, and I'm speaking after His Excellency, Kgalema Motlanthe. Then he said to me, just remind him that we've got unfinished business, because he called us 10-point dictators. When that happened, I got a lot of calls to say, why are you not writing and to correct him or to attack him? But fortunately, I know him very well from many days as a leader. And I realized that he's talking from a point of view of concern. And the issues he's raising are the issues that we need to look at objectively. So one of the things I did was to invite him to our village. Unfortunately, he has not yet come so that we can show him what we are doing. But I think in time we'll honor that invitation. So we resisted the temptation to write to him. We thought that we needed to engage and have dialogue. You see, again, it has been emphasized that the state owns the majority of communal land in South Africa, except in KZN perhaps because it's under Ingonyama Trust. Now, the point I'm making here is that there is this view. See, when Dr. Klassen started, he started by saying that traditional leaders own land in communal areas. But it's not true, because as he finished, he realized that actually we don't own land. We are merely land administrators in the rural areas. And local municipalities also come in there. Now, this issue of title deeds is a very important one for us. And what we are saying is that, firstly, for residential stands, there should be title deeds offered to each member of community with full rights to the area where they are living. That's very, very important. And there is this view that maybe people will sell their stands. But selling your own stand is also a constitutional right that you can enjoy if it means some benefit for you socio-economically, depending on the material conditions that you have. Because how do you allocate title deeds to people in the cities and in the townships and not give us in the rural areas where we are staying? It doesn't make sense. And I think that way government infringes on our constitutional rights to decent housing because the title deeds are more economical and viable than permissions to occupy or PTOs. So it is true that the members of the communities should have title deeds, but my view is that we need title deeds which are conditional and should be based on use it or lose it principle. You see, the issue is that if you have land and you don't use it, wherever you are, and it doesn't benefit you, then you are in the same position as anybody else who doesn't have that land. You see, we've got that challenge of vast tracts of fertile land unused, and this could be addressed through the issue of title deeds somehow. Now, we say that the marginalized communities in the rural areas are the de facto beneficiaries of the land expropriation without compensation. That's what government is saying very clearly. But we need to give priorities to beneficiaries with capacity and commitment to work. Because the problem is that government tries to make everybody a farmer. And that can be a solution. So, there are people there who are farming as we speak, and they need more land and resources to farm. But those people are often overlooked. And that's what we need to address in the system. So the aim should be that we must maintain the current benefits that are there, or at least improve. Now we deal with this issue of restituted land. Whilst I agree with some of the colleagues before me, money has been provided to those areas and the people who are beneficiaries, but money was not used, or well used, or appropriately used. And some of the CPAs still have lots of millions in their bank account. They don't know where to start. And some are fighting amongst themselves. So that's not the problem of government. It's the problem of us as leaders and our communities. So you have a myriad of problems on the ground, conflicts, amongst traditional leaders and councillors. They fight all the time. Contest for power between civic society leaders and traditional leaders. Traditional leaders on their own fight a lot. Ethnicity, and within a certain clan there will be fights there. So it's not only tribalism, it's a lot of... So what we're trying to say is that we need some kind of mutual respect and all those kinds of things. So in terms of land use options in rural areas, you've got a lot of things there that I'm listing. Residential, business, agriculture, tourism, sustainable utilization, biodiversity. Dr. Klassen, you can see that I'm not talking about mining. I don't like mining because I think it's not sustainable. Because once those resources are mined, we as communities are left without land. basically, and we were left with lots of social problems and left much more poorer than before the mines. So if there was to be some minerals in my area, I would be very opposed to mining. I'll then push the agenda of sustainable development and sustainable utilization of natural resources. The problem of planning. See, sites are allocated ad hoc in rural areas. You come today, I give you on top of the river. You come, you are on top of the mountain. You see, inappropriate sites for land use. For example, residential sites and business sites in wetlands. And people are given stands alongside the banks of the river because at that point in time, the rivers are dry. With climate change, when the floods come, the homes are swept away. And the issue is that the land is very cheap in rural areas. You go there with 10,000 rand, you'll come out with more than 20 hectares in many areas, just like that. These are the problems that we have in the rural areas. I don't want to go through each one of them. Now, these are the problems that we are having, that people don't take good care of land. There are dump sites all over. The dump sites in the streams. What happens when it rains? All of this is in the river. Now, people are polluting up the stream, but downwards, this is what is happening. Somebody wants to drink water. So we think we're solving a problem by going to dump in the rivers and in the bushes, but we're compounding the problems. That's why you have got diseases that are not known in modern times because of these kinds of practices. Okay, the issue of overgrazing on the land, what you were talking about, in terms of the topsoil and soil erosion and so forth. So if you go to the rural areas, most of the areas now are so eroded, there are dongas and dongas in the rural areas. So now you've got various governance models there that exist. You've got traditional councils, community trusts, NPOs, you can name it. But you see, some of these structures and arrangements are dysfunctional in many areas. And the model we chose when we were dealing with restricted land, that of CPAs, is bad. CPAs can't run a business. Now, this is where an element of dictatorship helps. You see, with CPAs, we go into a community meeting like this. We want an executive of 6 people. We raise hands. They're elected, but people elect those that are known to be very problematic to lead them. So those that talk too much and cause anarchy become the executive of a CPA. Then there's no progress. When you go there as government, you find people who are hardened, who can talk to you, who can't reason with you, who only want what they think they want. So this is the problem. So in our case, we started an integrated community development program with all those kinds of projects on the ground with a vehicle that is the Community Development Trust, because we thought that would be a legal arrangement that can work. But when you put these structures, it's better to select than to elect, as long as you have got objective criteria for selection. Because elections have proven not to work. Even in the political system, it's not really working very well, this thing of election. And the ANC is a good example. So we started with cattle farming as a project. But what our emphasis is that all projects must be as environmentally friendly as possible, so that you use the cattle manure to fertilize the soil and recover the soil. But also the type of cattle you should farm with are the ones that are resilient, that don't, that can withstand harsh conditions. So are goats. So they should be as indigenous as possible, so that you don't have problems with your bonsmara may not work well in our area. The good thing is that you do feedlots which are expensive. And then you see the bonsmara emit a lot of gas compared to indigenous and they contribute to climate change. Then chicken farming, the same principle. You know, where you produce eggs, broilers, and so forth. But it means that local people are able to buy these commodities cheaper because they don't have to travel. But you're also creating jobs in the space. And then you also have the value chain. I think this structure is a chicken abattoir, where we've got a butchery for livestock and those kinds of things. So we explore the value chain from farming and so forth, from rearing them, slaughtering them, and so forth. That whole value chain is exploited so that you create more jobs. These are machines for producing chicks, so that you cut down on the cost of farming with, because if you buy eggs, it's cheaper than when you buy chicks, for instance. Down the line, we might need to produce eggs for ourselves, so that you close the economy, so that the economy of the area, it helps us. The money stays in the households, doesn't go outside. Okay? The same issues that we're talking about, climate change. Now we've got tunnel farming, which is where you see the tomatoes inside the structure there. And then we've got open field farming. So clearly, if there are heavy storms, you'll have lost investment outside, but your investment inside is protected. And we promote the use of drip irrigation because it's much more cheaper, not cheaper, cheaper in terms of electricity because you don't waste water when you use drip irrigation. So these are some of the products we produce, cucumbers right inside the tunnels in our village, green peppers, jalapenos. We also do fish farming with the tilapia and the catfish. The wastewater that is there is channeled back into the fields. By that time, it's very fertile because it has got the feed, the remains of the feed, and the droppings of the fish. Then you're also trying to... Then we started a project just to look after the land. And I'm going to go through this because I've got 4 minutes left. You see, this is the land that I inherited when my father passed away in 2004. You can't do anything there. It's infested with bush. So we started a project there for bush clearing, to clear. One of the byproducts is wood, which we could sell. This is another problem plants all over. This is the team that we have employed to do that. The project is currently going. But you see, after clearing, you see how the recovery starts with the land. It opens up, grass is coming, which means you'll have enough food for livestock. Look at that. Indigenous trees, other indigenous trees, on their own, they're coming. Of importance, the marula tree begins to multiply. We only had about 3 trees, big trees there. Now it's more than 100. And the means of propagation is goats. The goats eat, they go back to the kraal in the morning, they're all over, they're dropping the seeds. And that seeds have been prepared from the gut. They germinate quicker. We have a wildlife economy project. We created a game reserve in a community, which has got buffaloes now, got eland, got impala, nyala, and impala. Okay, the other issue is that of fencing, because without fencing, all of this cannot be achieved. And then we developed, established a guest house, beautiful guest house. What I didn't tell Monli is that this structure was destroyed by fire over the last 3 weeks or so. So I forgot to mention that to you. I'm sorry about that. But we're finding processes of trying to rebuild it, and we will get back on track with it. So in terms of land use planning, these are different sites. You can see the tunnel sites. You can see where we've cleared the land for preparing it for plowing. This is where the game reserve is. And then the way forward is that we just need hands-on leaders, whether they're councillors or leaders of CC. They must be hands-on, selfless, and progressive. And just do the work and focus on what is right. Because you see, what's happening is that all of this that we are doing, we are achieving without a title deed. Because we really don't need it. The only time you need a title deed in farming is if you want to go to the bank, where you will then use the land as security. And it's something that we need to really apply our minds to very carefully if we want to go that route, because government does have grants. See, they must just be managed properly and go to people who are ready to work the land. Because you see, for farming purposes, I wouldn't issue title deeds in communities, because they will end up with lots of debts. And farming is very, very expensive. Now, with our model, the one thing that is important is that we create jobs. We create jobs and jobs and jobs. And that's how we fight poverty in rural areas. Nothing else. So where a commercial farmer would use 4 workers, will probably use 8. Because our mission is not to generate a lot of income that sits in the banks, millions and billions, but it's to fight poverty. So if you say to us, how rich are we as the trust? I'll go and say, no, we're employing 500 people currently. And probably spend about 8 million a year for those. So our revenue is in the households. That's where you can find it. Whether people are eating, whether people are going to school, whether people are safe, whether people got houses. That's our revenue. That's what we must focus on. Thank you very much.
What Chief Matsila omitted is the name of the VIP guest who officially welcomed the buffalo to the game farm. A very well-known individual who has an affinity for those particular animals. Yeah, just to move on to the next, the next speaker. Just to, the COSA speakers in the room will forgive me for telling the story, but it's very pertinent for the purposes of the next subject. There's a story that's told in Joburg Townships about back in 1993 when Chris Hani was assassinated, and then people traveled from all over the country to come and bury Chris Hani, the big rally big service at FNB Stadium, and there were all the people and other people couldn't make it into the stadium, but as I said, like lots of buses came from all over the country to come and bury Chris Hani. And everybody went back to their various provinces, but the buses from the Eastern Cape went back empty. It was just the Mkandule branch, the Lusikisiki branch, the buses were empty. And then suddenly, informal settlements suddenly cropped up all over Gauteng. And to this day, as people will tell you, if you walk into an informal settlement, you are most likely to hear isiXhosa being spoken in an informal settlement. Yeah, but like the real thing is that basically kind of like the urban migration is a very real thing, and because of economic depression in many rural areas. And one of the most depressed areas, as we know, is the Eastern Cape. I mean, like, and it's a great tragedy. The hollowing out of that province is an immense tragedy for our republic. So the next subject that we're moving on to is basically Professor Charlton, who is at the School of Architecture at Wits, will speak to us about urban planning and spatial planning in the urban areas, and about basically how to manage that. If Professor Charlton could come up, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to flag some urban land issues in this forum. As has already been mentioned by a number of speakers, in fact, it's key to focus on urban land issues in addition to the very important rural land issues that are being spoken about today. South Africa's total urban population is about 34 million. It's a 2015 figure. That's a level of urbanization that is high. It's around 64%. I heard a slightly higher figure mentioned earlier, but it's high and it's growing. And it's very important to think about urban land for a whole variety of reasons. Of course, because it affects these large numbers of people living in very tight spatial configurations. It's, of course, to do with the prosperity of cities, prosperity of people's lives, multiple forms of potential opportunity for people, and so on. And as Mondli Makanya wrote a few months ago, people in urban areas and moving into urban areas are seeking a place in the modern economy, driven by the belief that life in urban areas offers social mobility for them and their children. So the matter of urban land and housing is, of course, complex. It's a very multifaceted issue with economic, social, political, spatial dimensions. It's extremely hard to do justice to any of these in one short session. So in this presentation, I'm simply focusing on 3 overall points. And the focus is very much on low-income housing and land and that sort of nexus in urban areas. And just to say that much of the material comes from a Gauteng perspective and is drawing on a variety of sources. So the first point, the first overall point, is really about need and responses to need. So it's about the huge pressure for urban accommodation, the fact that this pressure is reflecting diverse needs, not the same kind of need, and that it requires very diverse responses. So some of the ways in which the need is felt or being expressed in the way people are living in urban areas, which is familiar to us, is in things like informal settlements, and in fact the densification that's happening within informal settlements. There's not so much an increasing growth of informal settlements, but densification within informal settlements. A second sort of manifestation is in backyard rooms. There's actually been a phenomenal growth of backyard rooms in urban areas, both in old and in new low-income residential areas. Somewhere like Johannesburg has experienced quite dramatic growth in that regard. It's one of the ways in which the city is densifying is through backyard rooms. Other kinds of expression of this need, in some places, multiple occupancy of apartments or old former office blocks or warehouses, where we're seeing very intense occupation of small spaces, informally or in unauthorized ways. We'll be very familiar with this in Johannesburg, in the inner city of Johannesburg. Other ways in which this need or demand is being expressed is through land invasions, protests and demands for state housing, and of course a rise in homelessness and people living unsheltered in public spaces, also something that's very visible to us, those of us who live in somewhere like Johannesburg. So there are multiple ways in which these needs are being expressed, and what is being expressed is varied needs. So sometimes I would argue the need or the demand is for a home, land, security, a permanent place to put roots in the city. But in other cases, it's perhaps a demand for very cheap, low-cost, minimal expense place to live, a kind of an urban perch that is not consuming lots of resources. That's different to a permanent rooted place in the city. That's a different kind of need that's being expressed. And another kind of need might be to live in a particular location, a very convenient place to live. So there are a variety of needs being expressed in our urban areas related to multiple factors and situations, such as cross-border migration, forms of circular migration, rural-urban linkages, playing out in different priorities people might have in relation to their urban lives. So given these various ways in which desire for urban accommodation and land is being expressed and the diversity that underlies this expression, there need to be this variety of responses. I think something has jumped here. Let's go to that one. A major response by the state so far has been the low-income housing program, the RDP program, as we colloquially, the nickname for it is, which has in fact been a very significant means of land redistribution because it's large numbers of houses for freehold ownership delivered to the poorest of the poor. This has added something like 24% to residential property stock in the country. It's an enormous and highly significant program, fulfilling the right to housing that's in the Constitution. In fact, this image is from some years ago. The delivery is closer to 4 million houses now. And I want to spend just a few moments on this program because of its scale, its impact on cities, its impact on so many people's lives. It's a highly significant intervention, but with very mixed outcomes. And in my saying that it has mixed outcomes, I differ from some other commentators who see it either as largely a bad intervention or those who see it as a very positive and see it very uncritically as a positive intervention. So I want to note some of the positive and negative features of it because of what that suggests about future housing development in urban areas. Perhaps I could just say that the timer's not on because I've got no idea how much time I'm using, which is great. I'll just go on. On the negative side, a key problem that is constantly spoken about in relation to the RDP program, the typical critique is that these developments are often located on the edges or peripheries of urban areas, very costly for municipalities in having to extend infrastructure and to service and maintain distant localities. Also not helpful, a negative impact on households trying to access opportunities in the city with very expensive, cumbersome, inconvenient, unsafe public transport. There are a whole batch of reasons driving poor locations, such as the cost of land, so it's easier to develop where it's cheaper. Also, the ability of those with power and resources to object to development in more contested parts of the city, and arguably a whole other set of agendas driving locations, which there's no time to go into. So that's one of the big issues about the RDP program, is this location. There are also problems with the title deed award and registration. A big concern is around the delays in issuing title deeds for a whole variety of reasons, and questions raised about how easy it is to rectify the backlogs, given that as time passes, the occupation pattern on the ground, in other words, who's actually living in houses changes. That's a natural thing. And questions about the ongoing upkeep of the title deeds registry, given the scale of housing delivery. So bound up in these kinds of discussions about ownership, proof of ownership, and location of the housing is a critique and a skepticism of the role that this housing plays as a financial asset, which can be used as collateral for loans, also used to progress to bigger and better housing. So there's a very strong argument, a well-known argument about the role that property can play in that regard, but a whole lot of debate about the extent to which it is playing that role and can play that role in our context. I think there's a dearth of research in this on sellers and buyers, just how and in what ways the housing is performing in the property market, both informal exchanges and formal. But connected to all of this is the debate about the extent to which housing is able to impact on poverty circumstances more broadly, through being used as a site to generate income, for example. A few years ago, an extensive assessment of state-subsidized housing's contribution to leaving asset poverty found generally poor functioning of housing as a financial asset, but contribution to people's lives in all sorts of other ways as a social and familial asset that has physical, symbolic, and economic functions. So what I'm flagging are the debates around the ownership, the location, etc. That's not to say that there aren't huge successes in the housing program. There are. A whole lot of shelter has been delivered, good access to services, contributions to dignity, and certainly in areas of Gauteng, there's some examples of well-located housing, mixed income housing, that I think are areas to be proud of and interesting projects. But there are lots of questions about the future of this program, lots of evaluation and assessment in the past, including its financial sustainability for government, for municipalities, for households themselves. And going forward, what's being spoken about include the following 3 ideas about the future of housing in urban areas. The one is about mixed income mega human settlements, which is kind of more of the big major housing projects in peripheral areas, and that's a big drive that's being spoken about by national government and Gauteng provincial government. A second is around site and service schemes, serviced land for people to build their own houses on, and that's been part of some popular demand recently. And third, the in-situ upgrading of informal settlements. Each of these have individual land ownership components to it, and each, in my view, can potentially play a very important role, but it depends a lot on the nature of the individual projects and how they connect to the city. That is the key thing for me, how they connect into the city, and also, in addition to that, in themselves, those 3 strategies are not enough. We need much more diverse and different kinds of strategies in different parts of the city if we're going to have a way forward to meet this huge demand, the diverse expression that it represents, and the links to the economy, which is the bit that I want to go into next. So the point 2, the major point 2, is the link between housing or accommodation and urban economies and opportunities. And a big issue around this is the notion of access to work opportunities or to means to bringing in an income in a context of joblessness, hugely high levels of unemployment, access to other opportunities of cities, to enable choice in cities. Access is about connections, it's about transport, it's about linking people into these opportunities, but it's also about creating locations of opportunity for people to live in, to work in, to do small-scale manufacturing, to be productive in the areas of opportunity in the city. So what we currently have is a spatial geography that does not reflect this at all, despite all the legislation, all the policy interventions since '94 trying to undo the legacy of the apartheid city. We remain with very much an apartheid city structure. I won't go into the details of this map because now that the timer's on, it appears to have accelerated dramatically. But what we need to be doing is more diverse kinds of housing in well-located areas. This is an example of rental going up on Louis Botha Avenue as part of the Corridors of Freedom in Johannesburg. But things like this that provide living and working places of opportunity close to middle-income areas, close to areas of privilege in the city. And we need all these diverse forms of accommodation, including cheap rental, overnight shelters, a whole range of things. And we need to think very carefully about future developments that are disconnected from current economic opportunities and trajectories of economic growth, or that rely on the idea of creating an economic base. In other words, we need to avoid the idea that we can create housing developments and then come thereafter and create economies. Research shows it's extremely difficult to do that, almost impossible to do that. And I just want to say what this map shows from the Gauteng City Region Observatory. It's been shown many times in housing and development circles. What's being shown in red are the number of businesses per square kilometre. That's kind of a proxy for economic activity. It's a Gauteng map. The middle bit is Johannesburg. You can see Tshwane up to the north. You probably won't be able to see, but there is a very pale sort of grey dot in there, which is the unemployment dot density. And what's being shown in blue are planned housing developments, the bigger dots showing big-sized developments. So what the map is showing is a disconnect between planned mixed-income housing developments and economic activity, one that is very concerning and that a number of us think is not the way we should be going. And this is what the mega human settlements trajectory is suggesting about what we should be doing. So, point 2, urban access is key. For some, this might be synonymous with securing land ownership. For others, land ownership may not be the main priority in an urban area, but it's about being able to be in an urban area, safely being able to connect in various ways, perhaps with one's financial and emotional investment somewhere else, out of the city, in another city, in a rural area. But we've got to allow for that and facilitate it in urban areas. So point 3, diverse mechanisms are needed to facilitate access and forms of redress, and multiple actors are needed. So one of the conundrums we're facing is why spatial forms of cities, distribution of opportunity and access is so unequal, despite much legislation and policy aimed at changing this. There are various explanations for this, but there are also key drivers in other directions. The trend towards gated communities has increased significantly since the 1990s, driven by fear of crime, fear of the other particular forms of consumer culture, etc. All of this colludes to create more, not less, separation, differentiation, isolation. And included in this is partitioning off of existing neighborhoods, gated areas, access control, etc. Instead of these sorts of trends, something different needs to happen. It needs to be clear that all opportunities, the opportunities for poor people to live decently and affordably in well-located parts of the city, these opportunities deserve to be created, must be created, will be created. They'll be created despite facilitation of them if we don't do anything about them. They'll be created through the land invasions, occupations of buildings, informal settlements, etc. So it shouldn't be up for debate that we need to be creating better places and more places of opportunity for poor people in well-located parts of the city. We can't think of a strategy of taking economic growth to areas of poverty only. We can't only be doing that. We also need to be enabling poor people access to privileged areas. So there are a whole variety of mechanisms that are already underway that people are using and thinking about. I can point to government-developed social housing on state land in middle-class neighbourhoods. There's an example of this that's trying to get off the ground in Norwood, in Patterson Park, linked to the Corridors of Freedom. There's also the City of Johannesburg's inclusionary housing policy, which requires all new developments over a certain size to incorporate a proportion of poorer residents. This is still under debate or contestation, but it's an attempt to try and do more inclusionary development. Upgrade of informal settlements in situ is another mechanism. But this kind of work is slow, it's difficult, it frequently encounters multiple resistances from host communities with all sorts of concerns. And these concerns must be heard, must be deliberated, and there are processes to go through this. So projects may be significantly delayed or derailed because of these kinds of problems. And we're up against all sorts of contrasting logics, as was recently pointed out at the Urban Land Dialogues hosted by the South African Cities Network. One of the problems is cities or municipalities' reliance on rates income, which drives a particular logic, at the same time as municipalities are supposed to be undoing an apartheid legacy and bringing poorer people in who will pay less rates into better localities. Those are competing logics that are not well resolved at the moment. So, in my concluding comments, these projects, these incursions into areas of privilege are important to get into the national psyche and into the national consciousness. This kind of transformation, these forms of access and opportunity is a fundamental part of our future in everybody's interests. And this kind of real transformation needs to happen. There are multiple mechanisms which can be looked at. It's not only about distribution of rights, it's also about sharing rights. Granting use rights over land for a particular time, even if underlying ownership remains in a particular way, or putting in place temporal rights or contingent limitations on rights so that someone can't have the maximum benefit or exclusivity forever. So those kinds of mechanisms are there, but we need to be experimenting with them more, pushing with them more, and I think very importantly, there needs to be a much better public dialogue about these kinds of things in urban areas. So the kind of thing that the two newspapers have done in their series of articles leading up to these sorts of discussions, I think there needs to be an urban component of that, which is not just retained in the sort of urban and housing and spatial people's in-house conversations, but is very much about bringing middle classes and the public consciousness into in what ways we need to transform our cities that reflect this apartheid legacy. So to bring it into the public imaginary and to understand that the responsibility for this needs to be shared by all. It's not only a government responsibility, it's all of our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think one of the great things about this debate has been the fact that, we're having this conversation. And the conversation may be hard, ugly, and heated, but we are having this conversation. And I think there's an urgency about this matter. And that, I know that there's a political party that has kind of like, which wears colors quite close to the dominant color on these banners that will claim credit for bringing urgency to this particular conversation. Yeah. And there's a thing that people say often, and which is that, comparing us, this country, could we go the way of the country next door? And I think one of the things that is very positive about the conversation that we're having in South Africa is that next door, the commercial farming community was very much closed, very iconoclastic, and going its own way, very separate from the rest of society and not in the debate. In this country, the commercial farming sector is very much part of this conversation, and I think that's, and in the policy making as well. So I think that's a great positive for this country. And so Dan Kriek, the president of Agri SA, a cattle farmer from the Vrystaat, will be our next speaker and the last one of this particular segment of the day. Thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Waldemar and Mandi, thank you very much for creating this opportunity. May I just say that I've been mentioned a few times in the report, and please, you cannot believe everything you read in the papers. I want to pick up on Mr. Motlanthe. Good to have you here. I want to pick up on where Tembeka started this morning. I'm as Afrikaans as you can get, and he quoted from the preamble of the Constitution. So my great-grandmother was a nurse in the Anglo-Boer War, and she carried her bed throughout the Boer War, and she was a nurse in the concentration camp in Heilbronn, and my great-grandfather was shipped over to Ceylon in exile. And when we speak about recognizing the injustices of the past, there's also a great injustice there. But do I resent the people of English-speaking people? No, I don't. In fact, my great-grandmother never ate tin fish in her life again because she believed that Lord Kitchener, because the ship sank and he drowned, and she believed that the fish ate from Lord Kitchener. Sorry guys, it's too much information. And she never ate tin fish again. The reality of the situation and the political dilemma that we have is that after the colonial period was finalized and all the upheavals that happened in the colonial era, white South Africa was put on a path of development, and my family was given the opportunity to do through hard work what they did, and black South Africa was not put on a path of development. And that is the essence of the political problem that we need to solve, and that is the essence of why our Constitution is written the way that it is, and that is why we have this political dilemma which we will all have to solve. So let me just start from that. So I wanted to say that because I have to speak to a topic and it might come over as extremely commercial, but that's the topic I've been given. So I want to state that from Agri SA's point of view, that we do recognize the injustice of the past. And Mandi, would you please write something about that, yes, we are part of the solution and that we want to be. I'm looking out for that one. How do I do this thing? Broadly, I will speak about those 5 points, and I will try to be brief. So let's go to the first one, the Motlanthe report. I'm honored to say this in front of former President Motlanthe, that we do, as Agri SA, support the findings of the Motlanthe report wholeheartedly. It states quite clearly that it is not the Constitution, nor Article 25, nor the fact that compensation is payable that is to blame for the slow pace of land reform. And then I think everybody else dwelt on tenure security in the communal area, so I won't dwell on that, but to say that we also are in favor of property rights and security of tenure. Our role in the communal areas is an agricultural development drive, teaching people how to farm, and we are extremely successful in that, and I will speak to that a little bit later. The importance of property rights. I want to briefly, why is property rights so important to our well-being? I'm going to refer to the International Property Rights Index, and this is the index that gets published every year. And as you would know, there's an extremely high correlation between property rights and a prosperous economy and a just society. That is an economic fact. So where are we on the index confirms that there is a direct correlation between property rights and different dimensions of economic development. And the worrying aspect of this, as in South Africa, we are declining in our position on that index. And we are the country that's showing the worst decline in the world. So we are definitely moving in the wrong direction with property rights. We should extend property rights to people. It will be the biggest empowerment exercise that this country has ever seen if we can afford property rights to people. So we're going in the wrong direction. This slide just simply says the following. The stronger your property rights regime in a country, the higher the per capita income of all people in society, and it also enables entrepreneurship. A little bit about the economy and certainty. This is what we farmers deal with. I'm only going to deal with 2 slides regarding that, and you should take note. I listened to the climate change. I thought that was extremely insightful, because we will have to do what it's depicted on that graph there. We will have to produce enough food, affordable, healthy food for a population, and somewhere in the future, those 2 lines are going to cross. And then we have problems. So we need to take cognizance of that fact, and we will have to do it in a different climate, and a climate that we're not sure of how we're going to do that. So we will have to invest in technology. Technology is one thing, how you can deal with these things. What do you need to invest in technology? You need to be sure of your future. Once again, property rights, policy certainty, all those issues come to play. And then, what do we as farmers do? I sometimes think we're a bit crazy. We borrow money on the value of our land. We go and do a whole range of things for that. With that, farmers are some of the biggest risk takers in this country, but that's what we love, that's our passion, that's what we do. We take risks. And why do we take risks? Because we believe there will be a return on investment. So that amount, that is what, that is the agricultural debt. I think it is now up to 200 billion. That was the latest figure that I saw. So there are various reasons for that. So we must understand that Article 25 is the cornerstone of food security in this country. The value of the property is used to borrow money to produce the agricultural produce that we produce. That is just the hard fact. So as we move forward, and while we do understand the moral reasons for land reform, we've got a whole range of balances in society that we've got to uphold while moving forward. And that is why the whole problem is so complex. I'm going to speak about the plan. So Agri SA at our 2014 Congress approved the holistic plan, and then the next year in 2015 the financing plan. And just broadly, I don't have time in any measure to go into the details, but those are the elements of the plan, and you will see they are not only commercial of nature. Sustainable restitution models, support for farmers in communal areas, and I will speak a little bit about that later. A social compact, extremely important, our social responsibility towards our farm workers and labor tenants, etc. We do have that responsibility and we take it extremely serious. Promotion of partnerships, this is the one thing that I believe organized agriculture and commercial agriculture can take as a responsibility. Partnerships and make a huge contribution in land reform, and I will speak to that in a while. Then a public-private partnership for implementation, a special purpose vehicle. Yes, we do need the government. You cannot privatize it wholly. A right of first refusal was offered, and it was never taken up, so I have to list it there. And then viable, affordable finance. Finance is the big enabler. If we want to really do things big, finance is one, and I will illustrate that. And then a special purpose vehicle or an agency, or call it whatever you like, for proper implementation. Because we have good plans, but we don't implement. I'm not going to go through, I still have some time. We do focus on rural land, but the great need is for urban land. That is not our speciality. Then the partnership model. We saw a lot of that at the Bella Bella Summit. Nick spoke about it this morning. A tsunami. I think it is absolutely critical that we maintain momentum and that we take the best practice out of all those models that were presented there. And at next week's Congress, in actual fact, I have a session one morning where I'm going to have 4 of the speakers that were at Bella Bella, and I'm going to call it the 10-point plan for the president. And if you ask those farmers, it will be one communal farmer and two other farmers, what are the 5 main issues that 5 main points that made you successful, and what are the 5 points that you still need to make it big? There's your 10-point plan for the president for land reform. So that's next week. Look out for that. Then the financing proposals. And then farm workers, while I don't focus on it today because it's not my topic, I want to allude to the fact that Christo van der Rede has done some excellent work at the Pakisa process for farm worker housing and property rights for them. The communal areas, we are heavily involved there, and I will give 1 or 2 examples later. We believe that farms in possession of the state need to be put in productive use. We have heard the list of 4,000 farms. I believe that those people and the beneficiaries should get title, and that will unlock their farming operations. And then the Agri Development Fund, which I will deal with now. There's just a schematic presentation of the special purpose vehicle, and that is just the public-private partnerships where you get the funding, government funding and private sector funding and then leverage funding. You can buy land, capital investments, operational expenditure for emerging and commercial farmers, and you have economic development and transformation. So to illustrate that a little bit better, I actually want to spend some time, 3 or 4 minutes on this one. If it is a little bit too commercial, this was the plan that was presented to Minister Dlamini Zuma in the lead up to the Jobs Fund. And the challenge to the agricultural sector and to commercial agriculture is how can we get the economy growing while we do land reform, while we do transformation, while we're keeping all the balls in the air and maintaining all the balances, but make solid progress in terms of transformation and land reform. So we base our arguments on the National Development Plan, and may I add, I think the 2 documents that need to be our reference is the National Development Plan and the Motlanthe report. Those 2 will serve us well. Somebody said this morning, agriculture is just 3% of the economy. Yes, primary agriculture is 2.4%, but on the family farms is built a massive value chain. And you cannot separate that 2.4% and the 12.6%, depending on who you listen to, the agro-industrial complex. You cannot separate the 2. It's 15% of our economy. So if we want to get the economy growing and we want to move it up to 20% of GDP, what do we need to do? So as you all would know, agriculture, we have a commercial component, that's a commercial farming sector, and we have a development component. Now for the commercial farming sector, what do we need? We are still a sector, we are still exporting more than what we import. So the needs for the commercial sector is markets and policy certainty. I cannot tell you, and I want to stress and I want to say to you that I've never seen the farmers so worried and uncertain as I've seen them now. And that is not good for the economy. I hope, Waldemar, that your front page article on land prices that went down 32% is wrong. Because if that is the case, we've got big problems. We've got big problems. And the uncertainty levels are unhealthy, and in some areas they are even irrational. And we've got to change that around if you want to make the economy grow. Right. Then the carrot and the stick. I think we need a few carrots as well in terms of tax incentives, and then regulatory issues, make it the cost of doing business easier and streamline it. And then local and international investment. How do we expect the international world to come and invest here if our farmers do not want to invest themselves? We've got to be able to invest ourselves. Now the development component, and this is where we believe we need an agricultural development fund, and there you can see the principles of the fund. I hope you can all read there. What do farmers need? How was basically every commercial farmer in this country during the years when they had the privilege to develop, how was it done? It was cheap finance over prolonged periods of time. That is how it was done. So now we need to do the same for black agriculture, because now is the time where, while we uphold all the balances, that we develop black agriculture. So we subsidized finance over prolonged periods of time. Within that agricultural development fund, you've got 28,000 farmers, you've got Agri SA, you've got 30 commodities, you've got AgBiz, you've got almost 100 agricultural companies that will help to implement. What do we need to implement? Producer support, extension services, you can read them all there. Why do we need to do that? Because the two departments that are supposed to do that are struggling. So we have a responsibility to help, and we will help. Who are the beneficiaries? There you can see them in the communal areas. We have a commodity-focused approach. And I would just want to, after this slide, I'm going to dwell on the wool industry just for a few seconds. Existing land reform projects, current projects, and partnerships. So what it basically boils down to is if I have the chance as a farmer, I would like to buy the farm next door. I want to think from my little entrepreneurial spirit in my brain, a plan on how I'm going to empower my farm workers. And in the end, they should own the land. And it can be a win-win situation. That is what many farmers are doing and what many farmers want to do. We need to enable them through this agri-development fund. And then on the right, you can see all the positive outcomes that we as a country need. Food security, job growth, transformation, household income, and sector investment. This is just quoted from our transformation report. I want to give one example. Somebody asked the question here, is peasant farming, is it possible? We shouldn't ask the question whether it's possible. It is a political imperative that we get the people in the communal areas farming. And it can be done. And let me give you one example of the wool industry, the National Wool Growers Association, through a simple project. And this is just technology in terms of genetics, the RAM project, where the wool farmers in the communal areas of the Transkei and the Ciskei, a few years back, I think in 1994 and thereabouts, they produced 1.5 million rands worth of wool. Now they produce 350 million rands worth of wool. They are exporters of wool. I think it's almost 10% of the national clip. What has happened to those people? Per capita income has increased. They can send their kids to university. They can do all sorts of stuff that normal people do. It's a massive positive story of how the private sector and commercial farmers can take hands and increase production and, in the end, uplift the lives of people. And there are many other examples of that. Currently, we are spending 331 million of our own money, and this is our commodities, impacting on 100, and I think the correct number is 108,000 farmers. What can we do? With a lot more money, we can actually make a huge impact. I'm not going to speak about that one. The conclusion, we have a limited opportunity. I'm not a person that's this is 12 o'clock at night type of person. You get people who, it's always 5 to 12 for them. I'm not one of those people, but I do think we have a limited period under President Ramaphosa's first term to make this happen. We cannot only speak and talk and do that the whole time. We've got to start implementing. There's not a one-size-fits-all plan. It's complex. And then maybe the third bullet is what Agri SA would like to do. We need to promote and foster partnerships, ensure a life of dignity for farm workers and labor tenants, rapidly grow a class of black commercial farmers, get communal areas productive, and support our emerging farmers much more. Yes, the doors are open and we're talking. We can only talk for so long, then we've got to start implementing. We need more black farmers on more black farms, while we uphold all the other balances in society and the constitutional rights of everybody in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think we have now got to the part of food security. Chief Matsila, I'm going to usurp your role and be a tin pot dictator myself. We are running a little late, quite a bit late actually. So I'm going to ask that we compress lunch to 30 minutes. It is now 14:26. If we can be back in here at 3 o'clock, please. We'll start rounding up people earlier than that so that by 3 o'clock we're all seated. If we could please all cooperate at that point. Lunch is in the Rainbow Room, which is somewhere across here. Yeah. Do you mind coming up here?
Hi, sorry, because of the weather, we've had to change the venue for lunch. So we'll be eating lunch in the Rainbow Room, and there's tables in the terrace room, so you can help yourselves to food there. All the food is laid out. The halal food is out as well. And then if you wouldn't mind going through to the terrace room where you can eat, or you can stay in the Rainbow Room and eat at the cocktail tables. Thank you.